Welcome to all. May this time of worship touch our hearts and minds and offer us hope and promise for the days to come. Welcome indeed to Trinity United Church in Peterborough, Ontario. This July 25th service is being recorded and will be available on the church website. Please feel free to share it with family and friends. Leading in worship today is Joanna Macquarie and Robert Grandy, Minister of Music, with Margaret Maris, soloist, and with the technical assistance of Carla Buckborough. I'm Martin Dealey, a member of the worship leadership team. As Ontario has entered phase 3, our reopening task group will meet this week and will consider, amongst other things, when we might resume in-person worship. Watch emails from the church for more information. Next Sunday's service on August the 1st will be pre-recorded and will be available on the Trinity website.
Good morning and welcome. It's lovely to have you worshiping with us now electronically, and it's exciting to imagine that before too long we might be able to actually be in the same place at the same time again together. So how do you feel right now? Your answer might have to do with your physical state. Are you healthy or not? At this time of year, the question might relate to, are you too hot or too cold? Or how about hungry or thirsty? Or you might respond from your emotional state. Well, I'm happy, or I'm kind of anxious about something, or content or restless, or so many other responses we might have. I remember speaking to a 30-something-year-old parent one time, shortly after she returned from an exercise time at the Y. And she said, I feel so great, so powerful. And she went on and explained that exercise is not only good for you physically and physiologically, but she says that during and after a workout, she feels so powerful. We often begin our services with a time of brief silence and an invitation to take a deep breath. So let's do that now. And as you exhale, release distractions and anything that is causing tension or stress for you right now, so that you might be fully present. Breathing is something that we do a million times an hour, not a million, sorry, I should look up the stats, how many times in an hour, but many, many, many times in a day. And we often do it, of course, quite automatically. If you've ever experienced yoga in any of its many forms, you'll know that yoga teachers talk about the source of power for the simplest or the most complex of the asanas being in the breathing, and they invite you frequently to return to your breathing. Jesus, as we recall, resisted praise or adulation. Instead, he insisted that he derived his power from the one who sent him. As we seek in worship to attend to the empowering experience of the divine spirit in our lives, one way in which we do that, in which we signify our intention to do that, is through prayer. Today, our opening prayer comes in the form of a hymn, God of the Bible, Hope Seen in Jesus. You are our center. You are our home. Let's sing and pray together. I always find I want to get up and dance with the melody of that one. Did anybody else find yourself moving around? The latest version of today's bulletin calls this next section Reflection A rather than Time for the Young at Heart. With a little bit of reflection, I decided that there's adult content in this part. One commentary on our Hebrew scripture text called it part of the smutty summer reading. Let me introduce that scripture text by describing an exercise sometimes used with confirmation classes or in adult study groups. So I'd like you to imagine you're in a large church hall, perhaps something like Trinity Hall, and imagine there are 100 people gathered there to learn together and to discuss their faith together. And they begin to be divided up according to the current distribution of the Earth's population, which at this moment the stats seem to say are about 7.8 billion people. So there's an area of the floor that's been designated as Asia, and 59 of the 100 people are sent over to that part of the floor. For the Africa area, 18 people go there. Europe, 9 people. Central and South America and the Caribbean, 8 people. North America, 5 people. And Oceania and some of the more remote parts of the world, 1 person. And now, once folks are there, there might be an invitation to talk about the disparate way in which people are sharing the space on the earth and some of the consequences of that, of population distribution. Then the group turns to an example of resource distribution. Now, of course, this is not a new topic. Things like food and fresh water and adequate shelter and housing have been with humanity since long before recorded history. The Bible makes frequent references to needs like this. So, for example, Joseph and his clan end up in Egypt because there was a famine back in their homeland. In Jesus' time, 10% of the population controlled 90% of the land and the resources. And many of the controversies that show up in the Gospels are related to that topic. Indeed, the author of Luke Acts is particularly interested in this topic of distributive justice. So back to our church hall picture. You picture the people standing in their different groups, Africa and South America and so on. And we imagine it's a really hot day, perhaps like it is in Tokyo right now for the Olympics, or when Peterborough has a humidex in the 30s. And the leader brings out a wonderful pitcher full of cold, clear, drinkable water and asks about distributing it amongst the people. Well, of course, everybody wants his or her share of that nice, cool water, and it doesn't look even quite enough for 100 people to have enough. And then the leader pulls out the statistics about the distribution of accessible fresh water in the world. The 5 people in North America and the 8 people in South and Central America and the Caribbean. So those 13 people get 45% of the cool, clear water from the jug. Those in Asia, the 59 people in Asia, get 28%. The 9 in Europe get 15.5%. And the 18 in Africa get 9%. We're just doing it by imagining, but if you can imagine being there, it's a powerful learning tool and not an easy exercise, because it forces one to think internationally about privilege and how we use it. In a similar way, our Hebrew scripture reading today is both challenging and disturbing. Remember, it comes from the author of 2 Samuel, who seems to be a real champion of King David. He's already told us about David being anointed as king when he was just a lad, the youngest son of with a whole bunch of brothers. He's told us about David's triumph over Goliath, the Philistine giant, and of his musical efforts in winning favor with King Saul. How David's later military victories are at first appreciated, and then they seem to incite jealousy as King Saul ages and recognizes the acclaim that David is getting. We read of David's religious piety as he enthusiastically, with dance and music, was bringing the Ark of the Covenant, that sacred object of his people, up to his new city of David as part of his efforts to please Yahweh, his God. Today, we meet an older David who has chosen to stay behind in Jerusalem while someone else is out leading the army. Martin is going to share with us what happens next, but before he starts, I invite you to think about how you're going to listen. You could sit on the sidelines just watching what happens, and that's often how we listen to stories. However, in this case, I invite you to imagine yourself into the story. Imagine yourself into David's place or into that of the other characters in the story. Over to Martin.
King David built some beautiful buildings in Jerusalem. He made Israel a strong country. David took his army to fight many wars, and he won most of them. The most important thing David did was to keep the people of Israel from fighting with each other. For the first time in many years, the people of Israel got along with each other. One time, when David got older, he decided to stay home from a war the army was fighting. He wasn't strong enough to fight anymore. David didn't like getting older and not being strong. Standing high on the roof of his palace one day, David looked down at the other houses. He saw a woman named Bathsheba having a bath on the roof of her house. That woman is very beautiful, thought King David. Since David was the king, he thought he could have anything he wanted. So he sent one of his servants to tell Bathsheba to come to the palace. King David made Bathsheba sleep with him, and she became pregnant. Then David decided that he wanted to marry Bathsheba. But she already had a husband. Her husband's name was Uriah. He was away with the army, fighting in the war. So King David sent a message to the general who was leading the army for King David. Send Uriah to the place where the fighting is the fiercest. I want him killed. Bathsheba didn't like what David was doing, but she had no choice. David is the king, she thought. I have to do what he tells me. Several months later, Bathsheba gave birth to a baby boy. Now, there was a man named Nathan who helped King David decide things. Nathan was a prophet, like Samuel. He helped people understand how to live God's way. Nathan went to King David and said, I need your help to decide something. Of course, said King David. Then Nathan told King David this story. Two men live near each other. One of them is very rich and the other is very poor. The poor man and his family have no money, and just about the only thing they own is one small sheep. The poor man's children play with it, and they even take it to bed with them at night. One day, the rich man wanted to have a big dinner for a friend who was visiting. The rich man had lots of sheep of his own. Still, the rich man took the sheep that belonged to the poor man. He killed it and cooked it for dinner. King David was angry when he heard Nathan's story. That rich man was very bad. He should be killed. You are that man, said Nathan. This is what God is saying to you. King David, I made you a great king. You have everything you want. You are very rich. Why did you steal Bathsheba and kill her husband? Then King David knew he'd done a very wrong thing. I have sinned against God, said King David.
Martin was reading through the Ralph Milton's lectionary story Bible, text rephrased to be shared with children and youth. I hope some of you did identify with David and think about what you might do in that situation. How did you imagine yourself handling it? Or how about other situations in which you hold power over other people's lives? This author, who clearly admired King David, wasn't just telling us this tale to point out that even biblical heroes have weaknesses, but rather so that David's and Bathsheba's experiences might be held up as mirrors for us to encourage us to think about our own use of power. And think about the courage that it took for the prophet Nathan to confront the powerful king with his own sin. I particularly like the clever way in which he used a story to get David to condemn himself. As you read in Sherry's Friday update, the United Church of Canada is presently launching an appeal across our church for help in getting COVID vaccines to people in developing countries. And the appeal takes two forms: one, in encouraging us to speak to political leaders about the role that the country is taking, but also in making our own donations, which will help buy vaccines for people in less wealthy countries. Along with our regular support for our global partners through mission and service, this is yet another way in which we can concretely heed Jesus' call to distributive justice, to address the disparity in resource distribution in our world, and in the process, all of us be made safer. You can find out more information about that appeal on the United Church website, or look at your Friday update. So it's responding to things like that is a concrete way to help spirits sing and see the world becoming whole. Thank you, Margaret. That too was a prayer. Let our spirits always sing. But one of the times when my spirit sings is when I'm out in nature, hiking or being among the trees and the fields and the mountains. Did anybody ever climb a mountain? Or how about a drumlin? I bet you've climbed drumlins because we have so many of them around here. Or how about driving up to the Champlain Lookout to see in the Gatineau Hills so you can see the Ottawa Valley? Or some of you have probably climbed the 512 steps to the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Remember peering out over the landscape with a bird's eye view, which turns houses and barns and trees and grazing sheep into toys? Such experiences tend to take me to the two ends of the power spectrum. On the one hand, I feel rather powerful having gotten myself to that place. And then looking at that vast vista, I tend to feel very small. Our biblical texts today both speak of power and humans' use of it. I suggested that Martin read about David's dance with temptation from Ralph Milton's lectionary story Bible, because for me it heightens the challenge of what to do with some of these disturbing biblical sagas when we have to think about how we might share them with children or youth. The saga of David and Goliath, for example, is a favorite one to share with even very young children, as it points out that you don't have to be big and tall and covered with armor and so on to have quite an impact. David there seems like a bigger than life person, a hero who in our day he might be memorialized in a statue. However, like the heroes of the colonial days in Canada, David was a man, and a man whose position gave him power over others and an obligation to use it well. The sexual harassment which we seek to address in effective ways today has been plaguing women for centuries. When we consider the plight of Bathsheba, the unequal power dynamic becomes very clear. Does that scenario play out any differently today? Well, we certainly hope it does. And we're endeavoring to make changes, important changes. When I hear about gender inequalities in the Canadian military, I no longer think of that as an issue which I can hold out at arm's length. I think rather instead of the talented and enthusiastic young woman from our own congregation who is offering her time and skills and her compassionate heart to train to do search and rescue work. And I pray that she will be well as she does that work. Let's think from a different angle. Has anybody ever spent time in a tent? I'll give you a minute to recall those experiences. It might not have been as elaborate as some of the fancy tents of today. With COVID restrictions on travel this summer and last, there's been a resurgence in Canadians taking to the outdoors, many of them camping for the first time. So they've been enjoying hikes up and down hills and the magic of a campfire by moonlight or a sticky s'more on little fingers. Remember that the gift of being awoken by birdsong rather than by traffic, or fresh country air and the smells of the forest, hopefully a forest free of skunks. There's a sort of camaraderie with creation and a renewed appreciation of other humans, which can be encouraged by spending a few nights in a tent. And then there's the homecoming, the packing up, the driving, sometimes with children saying, "Are we there yet?" every 5 minutes. The unloading the car, the mounds of laundry, and yes, of course, there are chores, but also there's the awe, the luxury of hot running water, of bathing after spending days in 30-degree heat. In normal days, we kind of take things like kitchens and bathrooms and comfortable beds a bit for granted. But after a few days in a tent, they are sheer luxury, and we give thanks. It's from a place of gratitude and awareness like that we best address the challenges of our day, whatever they might be, and make our choices about how we intentionally use power well. One author calls it power with others rather than power over or under anyone. In one and a half years of COVID restrictions, when this little virus has brought so much of normal life to a stop, that time has taught us a lot about awareness, to be aware of what we touch and where we stand and how often we wash our hands and whether we forgot to put our mask on or not, and what we value and what we miss when we can't do those things or can't have those things. Thanks to the vaccine distribution, many are finally getting a chance to bask in the delight of renewed family contact. Martin, Susan, and I are some of those who've just recently had those opportunities, and it helps us to feel grateful. And when we bring our awareness to of those kinds of things that so affect us in positive ways. I'll say that sentence again because I truly believe it's from our place of gratitude and awareness of blessings that we can best address any challenges before us. It's not just Olympic athletes who train to use their power and their abilities well. The call and example of Jesus remind us to live intentionally and compassionately each day, owning whatever power we have and using it for the good of all. With that in mind, let's hear afresh a familiar text from the Gospel according to John. This particular account appears in all four of the Gospels, and of course in John, the latest of the four of them. It's developed more. There are more details. Reading from the 6th chapter of the Gospel according to John. After this, Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. Some call it Tiberias. A huge crowd followed him, attracted by the miracles they'd seen him do among the sick. When Jesus got to the other side, he climbed a hill and sat down surrounded by his disciples. It was nearly time for the feast of the Passover, kept annually by the Jewish people. When Jesus looked out and saw that a large crowd had arrived, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy bread to feed these people?" He said this to stretch Philip's faith. He already knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 200 silver pieces wouldn't be enough to buy bread for each person to get a piece. One of the disciples, it was Andrew, brother to Simon Peter, said, "There's a little boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but that's a drop in the bucket for a crowd like this." Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was a nice carpet of green grass in this place, and they sat down, about 5,000 of them. And then Jesus took bread and, giving thanks, gave it to those who were seated. He did the same with the fish. All ate as much as they wanted. And when the people had eaten their fill, Jesus said to the disciples, "Gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." They went to work and filled 12 large baskets with leftovers from the 5 barley loaves. The people realized that God was at work among them in what Jesus had just done. They said, "This is the prophet for sure, God's prophet, right here in Galilee." Jesus saw that in their enthusiasm, they were about to grab him and make him king. So he slipped off and went up the mountain to be by himself. As the reading ends, we are left with that picture of all the people eating and having their fill, of nothing being wasted, of Jesus not wanting to take credit for what God had done. And a peasant child becomes a hero and benefactor for many when he chooses to share his small amount of power and resources. In the hands of Jesus, it becomes so much more. So I started talking about being up on a mountaintop and that feeling of power. The Olympics, I particularly enjoy watching the opening as all the athletes file in, and even with the restrictions this time, it was lovely to see that procession. They remind us of the diversity and the abilities of the human family. Well, just as athletes have to overcome moments of discouragement or exhaustion, in our work towards shalom, towards helping to foster peace and well-being for all people, there can sometimes be obstacles, and the demands can feel overwhelming some days. And sometimes we're tempted to give up or just assign it to somebody else's task. I invite us to think in moments like that, to think about that young boy and how it must have felt for him to see his little lunch being a catalyst to feed so many. Think of him and resolve with divine help to use your power well. Let's hear from one who has a higher than bird's eye view of the earth.
In the time it takes me to say this sentence, 20 babies were born in the world. And about 8 of us passed away. So that's 12 new people every sentence. Over a year, that's 80 million people. And there are almost 8 billion of us all together in the world right now. So how are we doing? It's easy to get really distracted by the negative, that's onslaught of noise that you hear every day. Sometimes you miss the beautiful and the wonderful and amazing things that are actually happening around us. It's just about to be 2020. That's 2 decades since the Y2K millennium. In that time, over those 20 years, over 1 billion people have risen out of abject poverty. 4.4 million kids less a year die of childhood diseases. There are 130 million more kids in school. In the US, over that time, the violent crime rates have dropped by half. If you're a young American, your odds are 1/6 what they were of being a victim of violent crime in the 90s. And suicide rates around the world since 2000 have dropped by 30%. There's some really good things happening to us here on Earth. Since the year 2000, we've been living permanently in space, going around the world, seeing it so clearly, doing experiments on the International Space Station. In that time, I've been there twice. And there are 6 of us right now living off of the Earth. But how about the past 10 years? Solar generates 30 times more electricity than it did. It's the fastest growing energy source on Earth. And renewable energy sources provide 1/3 of all the electricity that we use on our planet. And in those same past 10 years, all three of Helena and my children got married. And we have a granddaughter, Eleanor, who controls her silly grandpa just by moving her eyebrows. Can you believe it's been 10 years almost since William and Kate got married? The iPad was invented 10 years ago, and Gangnam Style came riding in almost 10 years ago, the first video to ever reach 1 billion views on YouTube. And somehow we managed to survive the end of the Mayan calendar. Good work. Halfway through this past decade, SpaceX landed a rocket for reuse. It kick-started the space business. And Google Canada decided that my spaceflight was the 7th most significant news item of the decade, narrowly beating out Justin Bieber. Sorry, Bieber. And this year, in 2019, Ethiopia smashed the world record for tree planting. 350 million trees in 12 hours. And a lady named Karen Uhlenbeck, she was the first woman to win the world's top mathematics prize, the Abel Prize. And we discovered this year that killer whale grandmothers babysit. And their offspring, the young orcas, are more likely to live a long and healthy life. It's nice to have a grandma to help you. Or a grandpa.
I expect some of you will look that up and watch the rest of the video and perhaps share it with your children and grandchildren and friends. Let's come together in prayer. Holy One, thank you for good news shared in so many ways, in videos, in the encounters that we have each day, in writing, and in our memories. In you, we find our strength, motivation, and hope. With our God-given gifts, we would participate fully and well in your creation. Yet, like David, we sometimes give in to temptation and do not always use power wisely. May we be aware of those among us, both the well-known ones and the local heroines and heroes, whose example draws our attention, fosters courage, and motivates change. As the world focuses on both the sports and the distress in Tokyo, may people be well. May ideals of community building, open minds, and growing understanding be realized during the Olympic Games and around the world each day. May Christianity, science, and other great religious and philosophical systems help us to understand the interdependence of creation and our place in it, and to work with others for the common good. Just as the prophet Nathan had the courage to speak with truth to powerful King David, may we find courage and wisdom to address inequities so that all people may have opportunities to live in freedom and hope. May we seek to follow Jesus in generosity and justice, working to distribute vaccines, food, clean water, healthcare, and other vital resources equitably around the world. Be with our mission and service partners and with all of those anywhere who seek to address the needs of others. This July, Trinity enters a year like none other, a year of embracing change head on. In the midst of all our reactions to that, we would be faithful and faith-filled, honoring the legacy of our ancestors in faith and of our Trinity family, while also scattering our seeds wisely for the sake of people yet to come. Guide us, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrims in your bounteous world. We join in the Jesus prayer with Martin.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. We will now sing hymn 424 in Voices United. May the hope of God go with us.
May the God of hope go with us every day, filling all our lives with love and joy and peace. May the God of justice lead us all the way, bringing light and hope to every land and race. Praying, let us work for peace, singing, share our joy with all, working for a world that's true, faithful, and we hear us call.
Go now in peace. Carry on in hope and love, remembering your place as a beloved child of God, bonding gladly with others, seeing the face of Christ in them. And may they see the face of Christ in you. Amen.